This game really captures Alireza Firouzja's style, really great risks, opening innovations, and seeing if his opponent can make their way through the complications. This game was played on titled Tuesday, and his opponent is Ramil Hassangatin, a Russian grandmaster whose chess.com rating in Blitz is 2724. Firouzja's is 3075. Hassangatin has white, excuse me. Firouzja has black. Let us jump right in. E4, C6, and Firouzja plays the Caro-Kann defense, D4, D5. The basic idea here is to create a strong point on D5 but allow the queen's bishop to develop freely. The only downside is it does take away the most natural square for the queen's knight, which would be C6. Knight to D2 is played. You can also play knight C3, but knight D2. And the normal move for black here is DE4, and this is the main line of the Caro-Kann. But Alireza, always open to play something original, plays queen to A5. This has been played before, but rarely, and computers don't like it. But let's see how Firouzja does with it. C3, blocking the pin on the knight at D2 and strengthening the D4 square. DE4, knight E4. Now, if you put this in an engine, white has a slight edge already right out of the opening, but it's probably an original position for him, and he'll have to find his way through it. Bishop to F5 hits the knight on E4, which goes to G3. The knight goes back to G6. These are standard Caro-Kann ideas. Bishop to C4, aiming at the F7 square. Now knight to D7. This is already a novelty, but this kind of position, it's a natural move, basically supporting either an E5 advance or a C5 advance. These are the primary ways that Caro-Kann players deal with white's space advantage in the center. They play E5 or C5 to liquidate that space advantage. Knight 1 to E2 was played. H4, threatening H5 to hit that bishop, is a little more standard. The idea of knight 1 to E2 is to jump into F4 and take that G6 bishop off of the board and give white the bishop pair. Knight G to F6, and now knight to F4, threatening to take the bishop on G6. And Alireza's fine with that, actually. He could play E6 here. That's the safer option. But you have to worry about potential future sacrifices on E6. So Firouzja just jumps right in with E5, playing the pawn break right out of the opening. Knight takes the bishop at G6 and HG6. So some imbalances, have developed. White has the two bishop advantage, but Firouzja has this half-open H file, and the pawn at G6 takes away the comfortable squares for this knight at G3. White plays queen to B3. Now that's a double attack, aiming at the F7 pawn and the B7 pawn. So Alireza goes ahead and castles long, and he's going to give up this F7 pawn, but he wants to gain counterplay down the center of the board. Computers don't love it, but we'll see how it turns out. Bishop takes F7, ED4, playing in the center of the board, and of course the queen at A5 pins the C3 pawn, so he cannot retake it. So white goes ahead and castles. The king really needed to castle. It can't stay in the middle. The queen side is too vulnerable. But by castling short, he steps into this half-open H file that was opened when the knight took the bishop at G6. Now bishop to D6 was played. So computers like this knight to E5 move, which defends G6 and attacks the bishop on F7. Bishop to D6 is a mistake according to the computers, but I really don't understand why. The bishop is aiming towards the king's side. It seems like a pretty good move. CD4, and here's basically the reason why computers don't like this for black. The G6 pawn is hanging, and it shows a fairly simple attacking formation for white. Bishop to D2 to hit the queen at A5. Rooks come to C1 and D1, and then the D5 push is played, opening up lines against the black king on the queen's side. Firouzja plays rook to H4, and now bishop takes G6, and white has a two-pawn advantage already. And white does have the advantage here from a theoretical standpoint. There's no doubt about it. Bishop to C7 tucks the bishop away. Queen to E6. Now, bishop E3 turns out was the better move. Again, potentially coming at the queen's side. After knight G4, which looks strong because it threatens to take the bishop off at E3 and also attacks H2, but then bishop to F5 could be played, and white's actually doing well here. If knight takes H2, then just rook F to E1. and the threat of bishop to g5 is really nasty. So knight takes e3, f e3, rook d to h8. It looks like Firouzja would have some strength down the h file, but simply bishop takes d7 check, king takes d7, and queen takes b7. And the problem is the king is just too vulnerable in the middle of the board with the rook coming to f7, and black does not have enough against the king. But here, queen to e6 was played instead, pinning the knight on d7. King to b8 steps out of the pin. Now queen to f5. White's up 2 pawns, so he would be happy to exchange queens and go into an endgame 2 pawns up. Firouzja does not want to do that. So he plays queen to b4. He's now attacking the d4 pawn twice with the rook and the queen. Bishop to g5 hits the rook and also pins the knight at f6. And rook takes d4. So Alireza has regained one of the pawns, and we can see his central formation with these rooks looks somewhat pleasing to the eye. He still doesn't have the bishop pair, but black is beginning to fight his way back into this game. Bishop to e3 is now played. The move rook a to d1 turns out was the right move, offering to exchange rooks and put more pressure on this d file and knight on d7. After bishop to e3, the tide begins to shift in black's favor. Rook to d5, attacking the queen at f5. Now, queen to f3 was played. A move like queen to c2 was a little bit better, a little bit safer, and here's the reason why. After queen to f3, black's next move, knight to e5, not only activating the knight with tempo against the queen, but also attacking the bishop at g6. So white has to defend that with queen to f5. But now, knight e to g4, and there's a discovery against the queen, threats against the bishop at e3, and he's putting some slight pressure on this h2 pawn as well. The queen comes back to f3. Turns out the best move here is knight takes e3, and of f e3, queen to h4. And the threat of rook to h8 attacking h2 is just too hard to deal with. If white were to play h3, then the knight at g3 would hang. And so this would be too much pressure. But Firouzja goes ahead and takes the pawn at b2, gets a little bit extra material. Rook a to b1, queen to e5. And here the computer sees something ridiculous. This is really, humans wouldn't see it, but they actually like the idea of bishop to c1 with the idea of playing the bishop back to b2 on the long diagonal, but that's not realistic. Someone played that, you could get suspicious. Rook f to e1, though, puts some pressure on the queen. That's a much more natural move. Now queen to d6, and Firouzja has tripled on the d file. Bishop to f5 attacks the knight at g4 twice, so that knight goes ahead and takes the bishop at e3. The bishop pair is now gone. Queen takes e3, and now bishop to b6. A very strong move, not only hitting the queen, but putting pressure on this f2 pawn. Firouzja really has a strong initiative now. He's fought through those complications and is really doing well. The queen goes back to f3. Now rook to d2. Create the weakness, target the weakness, and that's what he's doing. He's just putting as much pressure as he can on the f2 pawn. Rook to f1 to defend, and now rook takes a2. And after being down 2 pawns, Alireza is now up 1 pawn, and he has this pressure continuing on the f2 square. Knight to e4 hits the queen, as well as offering the exchange with the f6 knight, so the knight is taken. Bishop takes e4, but now how does Alireza add more pressure to f2? That's right, rook to f8. Now both rooks and bishop are crashing in on the f2 square. Queen to d3 was played by white. Queens come off the board. He doesn't need the queens on the board for the attack anymore. Rook takes f2. The square collapses. Of course, he's threatening rook takes g2 check, but also there's a potential discovery along this b6 g1 diagonal that white has to deal with. Rook takes f2, and now bishop takes f2 check. It would be a mistake to play rook takes f2 here. Can you see why that would be an error? It would be a mistake because of this move. Rook takes b6, taking away the defender of the rook. And obviously, if he were to just take the rook, then white would be much better here up the piece. So instead, black would have to play rook to d2, and after rook to b3, you have an equal but complicated endgame. So Alireza instead takes with the bishop. Bishop takes f2 check, king to f1, now king to c7, stepping out of the pin and getting his king active, the pin that was on the b file. Bishop to e4, bishop d4, h4, and b5. And we can see these queenside pawns are beginning to run, and there is really nothing white can do about it now. And in this position, Grandmaster Hassan Gattin resigned. Definitely a archetype Alireza Firouzja game. Originality in the opening, getting himself in trouble, and then finding his way out of it and winning convincingly. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.